J'ouvre maintenant la réunion.
I'll call the meeting to order. Welcome.
27 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights. Pursuant to Standing Order 108, Sub 2, and the motion adopted on December 2, 2024, le comité s'est réuni en séance.
The committee is meeting in public to continue its study of the subject matter of Bill C-63.
The witnesses for the first panel just have a few introductory remarks to make. For those that are appearing in person, please use your microphone and your headset. Move it away from the microphone so we do not give a hard time to our interpreters, and also for their safety and health. For those in the room or using or appearing virtually, please wait to be recognized by the chair. Je parle français maintenant et...
I'm speaking French right now, and if you are not hearing me speak in English through interpretations,
understand what I just said in French, you do not have your devices turned the proper way. So I ask that you ensure that you have your device turned the right way so you understand the language of your choice and we're not interrupted midstream. Alors, s'il vous plaît.
So please, put your telephones in
mute if you are appearing virtually, and only unmute yourself when you are recognized by the chairs. Now I'm going to introduce our three panelists here for this morning. Premièrement, Madame
First of all, Ms. Frances Hogan, a lawyer, advocate.
Conference, welcome back. Madame Marnie Panas, Canadian Certified Inclusion Professional. And thirdly, Connecting to Protect, Madame Jocelyne Monsma-Selby, Chair, Clinical Therapist and Forensic Evaluator, who is appearing by video conference. I will give each of the three of you 5 minutes, up to 5 minutes, to say your introductory remarks. I understand it's a little bit difficult, particularly if you're on your screen, but when you have 30 seconds left, I'm going to raise the 30-second mark. When your time is up, I will raise that and I will interrupt you as softly and delicately as possible to tell you time's up, whether the 5-minute introductory or the question session from members to the panelists. And I just want to say we have with us Senator Christopher Wells, who is just watching us for the first hour. So welcome, Senator. Okay, I will now begin with asking Madame Frances Hogan to please start with up to 5 minutes.
Thank you for inviting me today. You have probably had the opportunity to hear from a lot of people about the harms of social media, so I will not repeat the laundry list again. Instead, I'd like to focus on two topics that hopefully will give context to that testimony and provide urgency for action. First, I want to emphasize that we are profoundly underestimating the severity of social media's impact on children due to limitations in how we observe and measure these effects. When researchers and policy makers discuss the harmful effects of social media, they typically point to studies of teenagers documenting rates of self-harm, eating disorders, and declining mental health among 16-year-olds. But these studies are echoes of the past, capturing the aftermath of social media exposure that began years earlier, typically around 12 or 13. What's alarming is that when we talk to today's 12 and 13-year-olds, we discover that they started on social media around age 8 or 9. In 2022, 30% of American children between the ages of 7 and 9 were already active on social media platforms. That number is probably higher today. This creates what I call the telescope effect of our understanding of social media's impact. Like astronomers observing distant galaxies, we're always looking at information about the past, of how social platforms were designed in the past usage patterns. This may be okay when we look at the stars because the heavens change slowly. But when we examine the digital lives of teenagers, their rapidly changing world means we end up continually surprised that rates of harm keep going up. A 7-year-old is influenced and impacted in a meaningfully different way than a 13-year-old is. The children starting social media use today are doing so at ever younger ages during even more crucial developmental periods. and with even more sophisticated and engaging platforms than today's teenagers we're currently studying. If we don't act, we're on track to wake up in 10 years and realize we fundamentally altered a generation's development in ways that we failed to anticipate or prevent. My second point concerns the emerging and underreported threat of the rise of AI avatars and their impact on children's social development. These AI avatars are sophisticated virtual companions. They use artificial intelligence to engage in conversation, respond to emotions, and build what feel like genuine relationships with users. They're designed to always be available, eternally patient, and perfectly attuned to their users' interests and needs. The leading provider of these AI avatars proudly announces that the average user, predominantly children under 18, spends 2 hours daily interacting with these virtual companions. This statistic should alarm us. Learning to navigate real human relationships is inherently challenging and sometimes uncomfortable. It requires compromise, patience, the ability to engage with others' interests and needs, not just our own. AI avatars, in contrast, offer a path of least resistance. They never disagree uncomfortably, they never have conflicting needs, and they never require complex emotional labor that real friendships demand. We need to expand our understanding of what constitutes social media. These AI-driven spaces represent a new frontier of potential harm, where artificial ease of virtual relationships further erodes children's ability and motivation to build genuine human connections. If we don't act now to understand and regulate these technologies, we risk being blindsided by their effects, just as we were with social media platforms. In conclusion, the problems we're seeing with social media are reflections of broader societal issues. The adults most negatively impacted by social media are often those already marginalized in our society, whether geographically, physically, or economically. While in-person socialization carries real costs in terms of transportation, activities, and time, online socialization appears free at first. The true cost is paid in terms of mental health, development, and human connection. Similarly, and perhaps most critically, the children most likely to become deeply enmeshed in these virtual worlds, whether traditional social media or AI-driven spaces, are likely to be our most vulnerable and marginalized youth. These are often the children with fewer opportunities for in-person social interaction, fewer resources for supervised activities, and fewer adult mentors to guide them through the challenges of growing up or provide context and support when they face online harm. We must act now to ensure children have appropriate and safe digital spaces, because their ability to meaningfully build relationships and will connect will shape the world we all live in for decades to come. Thank you.
Very much. I will now ask Madame Panas to please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am Marnie Panas. I use she and her pronouns. I'm a Canadian Certified Inclusion Professional. I led the development of diversity and inclusion at Alberta Health Services, Canada's largest healthcare services provider. I'm a director of DEI for one of Canada's most respected corporations. I'm the board chair of the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion. But today I'm speaking on behalf of myself and my own experiences. And I'm here to vehemently defend every Canadian's right to freedom of expression, the foundation of our democracy. But for me, and millions like me, we do not have freedom of expression because it is safer to be racist, homophobic, sexist, and transphobic online than it is to be black, gay, a woman, or transgender online. Online hate is real hate. It descends into our streets. It endangers Canadians in real life. In September 2021, I took the stage at a university in my hometown of Camrose, Alberta, to deliver a lecture on LGBTQS+ inclusion, a lecture I've delivered to thousands of students, medical professionals, and leaders around the world. While on stage, unbeknownst to me, a student, like many other youth who have been radicalized by online hate, had been live streaming my presentation to Facebook and several far-right online platforms. By the time I got off stage, thousands of people were commenting on my appearance, my identity, my family. The worst of the comments included threats to watch my back. My next lecture was canceled. Police escorted me off campus for my own safety. In March 2023, I was invited to participate on a panel celebrating International Women's Day to raise awareness for an organization in Calgary who works to protect women and children from domestic violence. Calgary Police Service and my employer Protective Services Unit had to escort me in and out of the Calgary Public Library where the event was being held because of the many online threats of violence directed towards me. Last February, emboldened by the introduction of anti-trans legislation in Alberta, people harassed and threatened me and others online at levels I had never experienced before. even trying to intimidate me through contacting my employer. Now, I'm grateful for the support of my current employer, who once again had to step in to have my back. It is rarely the people spewing hate online who are the greatest threat, but words are never just words. It is the people who read, listen, and believe in hate speech who become emboldened to act on what's been said. These words and the actions they fuel have followed me to my community, my workplace, and even my doorstep. The impact of this relentless harassment for simply living my life publicly, proudly, and joyfully as me has profoundly impacted my mental health and well-being and sense of safety where I live and work, leaving me withdrawn from the communities I cherish and wondering every time when someone recognizes me on the street, is this the moment where online hate turns to real violence, real physical violence? I feel far less safe in my community, in my country, than I ever have before. No, I don't have freedom of expression. There is a cost to being visible. There is a cost to speaking out. There is a cost to speaking before you today, knowing this is being broadcast online. And most often, the cost just isn't worth it. The people all too often silenced are those who desperately need these online platforms the most to find community and support. This is made worse when the same platforms allow disinformation to be spread that aims to dehumanize and villainize LGBTQ2S+ people, contributing to the significant rise in anti-LGBTQ2S+ violence as highlighted by CSIS this past year. The status quo is no longer acceptable. Platforms need to be held accountable for the hateful content they host and the disinformation they allow to spread. And the federal government needs to act. We can't wait. I've been called brave, courageous, resilient even, but I'd rather simply just be safe. People have a right to freely exist without fear because of who they are and who they love. And this is needed in online spaces too. In fact, our communities and our democracy depend on it. Uphold freedom of expression. Pass Bill C-63 and protect us all from online harms. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Merci à vous. Thank you. I now turn to Jocelyn Mons-Masselby, please.
Honorable Chair Diab, thank you for the opportunity to be here today and all members of this Committee on Justice and Human Rights. My first point, in Canada, our current legal framework addresses child sexual abuse and exploitation via the Criminal Code and Protection of Children from Sexual Exploitation Act. But we should not be relying on a broad duty of care by any internet platform. It should be law requiring the identification and immediate action to report and take down illegal sexually explicit images. We need regulation that is fit for purpose and safety by design. My second point, Bill 63 reads, reduce harms caused to persons in Canada as a result of harmful content online and ensure that the operators in respect of social media services respect their duties under the Act. This is a glitch. All internet platforms need accountability, not just social media sites. It takes just 3 clicks to find child sexual abuse imagery or child sexual exploitation material on the regular net. And this includes images generated by artificial intelligence found through accessing many, many online platforms, including the dark web. These IPAs are not only disguised within websites and embedded in emojis and hidden links, requiring the viewer to follow a digital pathway that can disappear as quickly as the next link is clicked on. In 2022, the IWF found there was a 360% increase in self-generated child sexual abuse reports of 7 to 10-year-olds, more prevalent than not self-generated content. This trend has continued into 2023, where the IWF hashed 2,401 self-generated sexually explicit imagery and videos of 3 to 6-year-olds. 91% of those images were girls showing themselves in sexual poses, displaying their genitals to the camera. It's normal for children to have curiosity to explore their bodies or experiment sexually, but that is not what the IWF found. What is shocking is the unsupervised access of children using digital devices. My third point. Guidelines respecting the protection of children in relation to regulating services and age of consent to data processing and in using social media. A duty to make certain content inaccessible. Caution should be used in passing regulation based on precedents set out in other countries. We need to look in turn at all the international laws, treaties, and conventions. A single guiding principle is in Article 5 of the UNRC concerning the importance of having regard to an individual child's evolving capacities at any moment in time in their interactions with the online world. My fourth point. The establishment of a Digital Safety Office of Canada, Digital Safety Commission, and a Digital Safety Ombudsperson. Could Canada benefit by establishing an online safety office and a children's commissioner or ombudsperson? The answer is yes. And several countries have been blazing a trail for us. These countries are part of a global online safety regulators network, which aims to create a coordinated approach to online safety issues. And Canada, sadly, is not at the table. Last week, I was invited to attend a global summit in Abu Dhabi, sponsored by We Protect and the UAE government. I was the only child protection representative from Canada, and I'm a third-party voice, self-funded. A few final thoughts. It took 50 years from the development of the Gutenberg Press to develop 20 million books. It took Ford 10 years to develop 10 million Model Ts. It took Playboy approximately 2 years to sell over 1 million copies each month. It took the global internet in 1995, 2 years to develop 20 million users. It took Facebook 10 months to reach 1 million users, and today's Meta's ecosystem, such as Instagram, WhatsApp, and Messenger, have approximately 2.93 billion daily active users. We need to close the gap between the rapid development and access of the internet and needed regulation. We cannot have continued partisan approach lacking civility to develop important regulation that is needed to protect children and vulnerable
Thank you.
individuals.
Thank you very
for
much.
hearing me today.
You'll be able to answer questions as well. So we will start with our first 6-minute rounds, and I will ask Madame Ferreri to please start.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Thank you to our witnesses here. We are talking about one of the most serious bills that I think have come before Parliament, certainly in my time and many others' time, C-63. And I want to start with you, Ms. Selby, if I can, because, you know, we have the Canadian Constitution Foundation who has said on record that Bill C-63 combined things that have no reason to go together. Van Geyn said the issue of the online sexual exploitation of children through pornography is urgent and serious and should not be lumped in together with the government's controversial plans to criminalize all kinds of speech and allow for civil remedies through the Canadian Human Rights Commission for Speech. My question to you is, shouldn't we have a standalone bill or legislation that protects children from online perverts? Shouldn't that be its own legislation?
Mrs. Selby, you're on mute.
Sorry. We definitely need regulation to protect children from sexual exploitation online. I wouldn't use the term from online perverts. I think there are many groomers. There are many reasons why children are exploited on the internet, and there's obviously a market for it, or it wouldn't be such a problem.
I guess I'd push
helps
back, and
you.
I would certainly call those groomers perverts. So I guess we just have a difference of language, but I see your point. But I think what I'm trying to ask you is, shouldn't we have a standalone policy that enforces laws to protect these children and also ensures that social media platforms have a duty of care to ensure they're not allowing this to happen?
So this is where we have a glitch. I believe that all internet platforms have a duty of care, but we need regulation that is what I would call best in practice to protect all children and vulnerable individuals on the internet. So under the age assurance umbrella, you have numerous tools, and if they are legislated to happen at the device level, everyone gets protected. Picking and choosing just certain media sites is not the only answer here. Very few people are protected when you take that approach. You need a broader approach to all internet providers, all internet
certainly,
platforms.
And I think we would agree on that for sure. I guess what I'm trying to say is there's a bill that the Conservatives have. It's called 412. It was put forward by my Conservative colleague, and it deals with exactly what you're saying immediately, as opposed to C63, which the Liberals have combined two separate issues that are not targeting the predators online and the sexual exploitation to I can't remember your last name, I'm sorry, Ms. Haugen's point of these young children whose brains are forever changed. There's not a parent out there that isn't concerned about this. But I think the issue, go ahead, yeah.
I view it as child sexual abuse via digital images. And there isn't a child protection expert on the planet that would agree it is okay for children to have this kind of exposure.
100%. 100%. And I think that's where we're going with this, whereas C412 directly deals with this immediately, as opposed to C63, which has combined too many issues that will not hold these perpetrators, or I will call them perverts, to account, as well as social media platforms, to your point, that exactly need to have accountability. If I can turn to Ms. Haugen, I was very interested in your testimony. It was profound. And you hit a lot of nails on the head in terms of the impact that this is having, social media is having on our children and exposing them too young to this. Without mandatory parental controls or algorithmic accountability in C63, how do we ensure platforms are actually protecting children?
Great question. So having a positive duty of care, I think, is a really critical component of the Canadian bill, because it says you have to be actively thinking about how your product might be misused and designing proactively for it. So parental controls, I think, can be really powerful. They're a set of tools, but not all children have parents that understand technology well enough. Remember, most parents today didn't grow up as a 10-year-old with a smartphone, right? I hope not. And it means that we need to make sure there is, at a minimum, a floor, a net that is catching all children. Because we also need to ask, should we be putting the obligation on parents when they have so much already that they have to deal with, to also stay abreast of exactly what threat is coming from where and what setting and toggle do they need to put on their phones. Mm-hmm.
So are you familiar with C412 that my Conservative colleague put forward?
I don't know all the details for it.
I would love to. I'd love to direct it to you or send it to you. I think it's addressing what you're saying and getting to the heart of the issue quickly and more efficiently than C63. Another question for you is, how does C63 ensure platforms understand their obligations without explicit definitions?
Great question. So one of the challenges when writing any kind of internet regulation law is that technology moves very, very quickly. For example, right now the Europeans are putting in provisions around or suggesting things like banning addictive features. In technology, it can be really hard to define what is an addictive feature. Like if I say, this is the thing you're not allowed to do, what usually happens is either the definition is specific enough that's easy to understand, in which case the tech companies immediately just do a slight twist and say, well, it's not it anymore. Or you have a situation where you write them at such a high level where what does it mean to have an addictive feature? So duty of care is a nice kind of flexible in between where you say, hey, you need to be demonstrating proactively that you are looking after the needs of children and designing safety by design.
Thank you very much. We'll now move to the next 6 minutes, please, with Madame Dillon.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here this morning. I'll start with Mrs. Marnie. Mrs. Marnie, I'm very sorry about what you've gone through, to be not able to express yourself, to be threatened for who you are. Can I please ask you if you think that having freedom of expression includes this kind of hatred that you have faced. Please, if you can elaborate a little bit.
And thank you so much for the question. And I would argue, I have so many privileges that I actually, do okay. This is with all my privileges. I can't imagine children and youth and people who don't have the privileges like the support of my employer and the people around me. So, and that's with all those supports. There is freedom of expression, but there's consequence. We all have consequences for speaking. You folks in the House of Commons can't just say anything you can in the House of Commons with some consequence. That has to occur online, and it has to occur in all of our spaces. Because today, again, I do not have freedom of expression. Even just visibly posting a picture of my partner and I being happy at dancing at a concert comes at a cost, and that cost often is ridicule, and that cost turns into harassment, and then that cost turns into people believing the disinformation that is spread online, which leads to policies that restrict my ability to even participate fully in society. It goes so far, and this is somebody with all the privileges that I have.
And we keep hearing, and I don't know if you had the chance to hear last week's testimony when Jane Doe came, a very, very painful testimony. And it was painful for all of us to hear what kind of evil can exist in this world. And these parents came, and there was one parent who had a child who was part of the armed forces who committed suicide. And they're begging. And we're talking about how parents should not be held responsible, completely responsible, because there's also a duty on governments and the platforms. And we know C63 applies to all online platforms. So my question is, and they're begging for us to do something as quickly as possible to mitigate the damages that are already done and that could come in the future. We keep hearing things about regulatory bodies and delays. Do you not think at this point it's better to pass something than nothing? Because nothing is perfect, but at least something they can give you support. We can give you support.
Yes, not sacrificing perfection for the good. The good needs to happen now. The fact is, if online platforms honored their own standards of practice and community standards that they already have in place, we probably wouldn't be here. And so they all come out with these great standards of practice, but anytime I report them for anybody for doing so, they're ignored. We're ignored. And so we need something now. Lives are being lost to this. And what's important is that there are a lot of youth who find community in online platforms, and that's essential when you think of rural populations, when you think of people like myself. The very first time I found somebody like me for the first time in my life, then I realized that I'm not alone. There are other people like me, was a life-saving moment for me. That was 20 years ago when the internet just first started. That saved my life. We need to protect those environments for youth and for people to find social connection in a healthy and meaningful way. That has been robbed from them. And the impact of that is violence, is death, is isolation, loneliness, and having to hide the most important parts of your identity. That needs to change now. We can no longer wait. Too many lives have been interrupted. Too many lives have been lost because of the harms experienced online.
And I'll continue with a story that just came out about an AI chatbot that encouraged a child to commit suicide. It was saying, come home, my king. And he was 14 and he had become addicted to the chatbot because that was his only friend. He, I guess, didn't have many real life friends. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you see this going forward, the addiction children have towards social media platforms, chatbots, and things like that?
When I grew up, as a child in rural Alberta, I got really good at being alone, and I really got good at keeping my secrets, the secrets of my gender identity, because that is where my secrets were safest. And I know there are many youth who are like that even today. And so having somebody, whether real or artificial, reaching out and showing some attention, it feels good. It feels validating. Then you start to seek it out. And that's where the dangers lie, because that might be your only place for that validation. And then that does lead to significant harms and violence. And that is who I'm concerned about.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Panas. I think, Mrs. Hogan, you wanted to jump in. If you want to say something, please.
So sorry. I was gonna say, I think addiction is maybe like not the exact word, but I would say that people form relationships, right? And we form relationships with those who we spend the most time with. And for, in the case of the child who killed themselves, it wasn't so much the guy addicted to them, he fell in love with this person who he talked to every day for hours and hours. And the reality is, if you had intimate conversations where you always felt safe with someone, they always validated you, you might fall in love with them too. And that child, it wasn't that they didn't have any friends. And I worry that sometimes we look at these issues around relationships with AIs and we say, oh, that person must be so pathetic, but you'd only turn to an AI if you had nothing else. This kid his parents didn't know anything was wrong. All they found out was they saw his phone afterwards, and when he lamented he would never be able to live a life with this person he had fallen in love with.
Thank you very much for that. I will now go to Monsieur Fortin. Vous avez 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
6 minutes, Mr. Fortin. Thank you very much, Chair. My first question is for Marnie Panas. Madame Panas, I imagine you have looked at Bill C-63. I would like to hear what you have to say about the complaint process with the, passing from the Ombudsman, the Commission, and so on. And how do you assess the complaints process?
Well, right now, thank you very much for the question. Right now, we do not have a meaningful process in place at all. We can't go online. There are no supports in place to go to, so we remain silent. We would just withdraw from the tools and the platforms if we don't find safety there. I think not having a place to go is a real problem. And so when we look at the processes that are going to be in place, it's certainly better than leaving us to try to fend this complex issue by ourselves. And most people with experiences that I've had, we don't even bother going through the platforms, and we have no other recourse.
Est-ce que le processus prévu à C-60...
The process that's in C-63, complaining to an ombudsman, is that, to your mind, efficient? Will it be effective?
It will be certainly much more effective than what we have in place today.
Madame...
I apologize. Oh, yes, Ms. Hogan. I'd like to hear what you have to say about the problem of attacks on freedom of expression and the protection of privacy. We've heard that this occurs on digital platforms, but we know that there is this type of juggling of the two interests. Are we going far enough? Have we gone far enough? Should we go further? What should we do to protect what exists now in terms of freedom of expression, but also to protect others?
You have to be very careful when writing these laws, because you can either write them from the perspective saying platforms are responsible for disclosing risk and demonstrating progress to reduce risk, or you can write them to say every instance of hate speech has a penalty. The challenge of the latter kind, where you say we have a zero tolerance perspective, no hate speech, is the computers can't accurately and reliably identify what is okay or not okay. What it will mean is things like erasing trans people from the internet because you can't tell is this comment hateful, right? It's erasing religious minorities because can you talk about religion confidently if there's a $40,000 violation for the platform? So as long as the law stays within bounds of saying you must disclose what risks you believe and demonstrate your progress, that can be okay. But we need to be careful not to believe that we can erase hate from these platforms without accepting that we will erase also lots and lots of legitimate speech, because the computers are just not that smart.
je vous
I'd ask you this. The definition that C63 gives with respect to intimate content visualization that falsely presents reasonably convincingly a person who is presented naked for sexual purposes or for sexual intent that is explicit. If it is reasonable to suspect that the person has not consented to that image, I shorten it, but it seems to me be a rather long definition. Perhaps I couldn't have drafted it better, but it's not a criticism. But do you think this is a good definition, or should it be rephrased otherwise?
The issue of non-consensual intimate partner images, so someone calls this revenge porn, and that is an example where we accept that the computer will get it wrong and be more aggressive than like that. They might sometimes take down an image of a person who maybe looks very similar to that person. But it's one of these questions around, do we accept false positives and false negatives? Having a broader definition for something like that is okay if the consequence is a little bit of pornography disappears from the internet. For things that are more controversial topics, that's where relying on censorship is much harder because the scope and the complexity and the diversity of ideas is so broad, and it's much, much harder for computers to do than just try to identify, is this the same person and is this the same image as what was reported? Because you're matching one to one instead of one to many.
Et les hypertrucages, à votre avis, il reste 30...
And deep fakes, I know I only have 30 seconds left. Deep fakes, to your mind, can we end up having effective means to deal with them? And if so, how?
This is a great example of where safety by design and having disclosure on how platforms operate is so important, because it is unlikely that we will be able to reliably identify, is this or is this image real or is it a deep fake? The computers will keep getting better and better at making these. That means we need to instead ask questions about, are we weaponizing the platforms or making ourselves vulnerable to people abusing these images?
Thank you. Merci.
Merci.
Mr. McGregor, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank all the witnesses who have joined us today to help guide the committee through this study. Ms. Panas, maybe I'd like to start with you. I'd really like to thank you for showing up today and explaining just how, your previous experience, your life experience, makes this approach a very important thing for our committee to consider. Because often whenever any party comes forward with a policy idea on regulating the internet or online spaces, the first charge that is leveled against policymakers is that you're taking away my freedom of speech, my freedom of expression. But I think you have quite clearly explained how by not doing anything, the status quo is actually affecting your freedom of expression right now. And I want to talk about this concept of like a public space or the public square, because when we're in a room right now, everyone has an equal voice. We can all hear each other equally. But on the online space, especially in social media platforms, the platform itself is not a passive bystander. It can actively promote content, or it can actively put it down into certain corners, and it can direct people down certain dark corners of the internet. My other committee is the Public Safety Committee. We've been looking at how our foreign adversaries make use of online platforms to spread disinformation. There's quite a lot of overlap with the subject matter that we're dealing with today. But there's also, we've had witnesses at that committee talking about not only do we need to take a law approach, a regulatory approach, but also try and talk about instilling a digital literacy strategy. Do you have any thoughts on that, just about equipping Canadians with the skills that they may need to navigate the online space?
Thank you so much for the question and the comments to support. this is scary being here, and not scary for you folks. You folks are pretty friendly, but I know that the moment that I leave this space, and I know the people who are watching me right now, and what that will mean to me online, is terrifying. Quite honestly, literacy. This is such a complex issue. The internet is so complex. Literacy is part of it. We need multifaceted approach to supporting this: education, supports, but certainly online accountability. You know, and I think about literacy. That's a really interesting word, because you look at X, for example, have banned the word CIS, cisgender, for example. And it's a Latin word that just simply means, it's a biological, chemical term that's often rooted in science, but it's been banned because of the implications of denying transgender people's existence. That's the whole purpose. So literacy would rely on the platforms to actually use language that is appropriate, rather than banning language that serves to actually eliminate me from society. So it's, the people need the literacy, but the platforms have to be held accountable into ensuring proper literacy.
Thank you very much. Ms. Hogan, I'd like to turn to you for my next question. We're kind of in a legislative deadlock right now in the House of Commons. Like, there's pretty much nothing getting done in our main chamber, and it's been like that since the end of September. In fact, we don't even have Bill C-63 properly before this committee. This is a pre-study. It hasn't even passed second reading. And the fact of the matter is that this Parliament is rapidly running out of runway. C-63 is still a long ways away from the Governor General's desk. You have just talked about how rapidly evolving this technology is. So it may be that we don't actually have a proper legislative approach to this problem for another 2 or 3 years. What are some of the things that a future Parliament really has to take note of? We have this draft of C-63, but what are some of the other things that we may need to think of in a future piece of draft legislation?
So one of the reasons I'm so excited about the approach that Canada took was you guys did more rounds of something called citizen assemblies than anyone else in the world did. Like, you actually had conversations, groups of Canadians went and argued about trade-offs on how to approach the internet. And this is what came out, other than the hate speech attachments that have been added on at the end. I think the bill overall, as a result, is pretty resilient. Like, it addresses a bunch of core things that need to be addressed. The place that I would encourage you guys to be a little bit more open-minded or a little more future-proofing is just ensure that the concept of what is a social platform is able to evolve. So, for example, virtual reality is easy to laugh at right now. If you go walk around Horizon Worlds, which is Facebook's virtual reality space, it's overwhelmingly full of people under the age of 12. Right? Age assurance is important for that reason. Talk to AI chatbots, overwhelmingly under the age of 18. Think a little more expansively about what does it mean to be social, because children are starting to say, or games. Games are another space that are effectively social networks. So as long as you're thinking a little bit more expansively about what's under the tent, the structure overall, and saying we need to have a proactive duty of care, we need to care about transparency, we need to care about these issues, is important.
Yeah, and I'll just close in this round because I only have a few seconds left by saying, again, at my Public Safety Committee, we have had witnesses who are complete and total experts in the AI space, and its rapid pace of development is one that leaves them greatly concerned.
And I would love to talk to your committee, because I worked in that space at Google.
We'll keep you in mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we'll move to our second round, and we will go to Mr. Brock for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and I thank the witnesses for your attendance. And I echo the commentary of my colleague, Ms. Ferrari. This is such an important discussion that we're having today. And I just want to clarify, I heard you, Ms. Hogan, say that you are not familiar with C-412, which ostensibly achieves the same result in terms of keeping kids safe online. But we get to it versus C-63 in vastly different ways. So it's unfortunate that you haven't had a chance to review that. Can the same be said for you, Ms. Selby? You're not familiar with C-412?
I've only glanced at C-412, and haven't looked at all the in-depth recommendations.
Okay, thank you. And you, Ms. Panas, have you had a chance to look at C412?
At a very high tertiary level, but not deeply, no.
Okay. I'm actually going to start with you, Ms. Panas, because I listened very carefully to your opening statement. You reiterated that in some of the questions that were put to you, that ultimately you feel safe in this environment, but the same cannot be said when you actually leave this building. You talked about various avenues of online harassment, and let's face it, that's the reality that Canadians are facing. It's not necessarily just children, teenagers, but it's also adults. There is a legal definition of criminal harassment in the Criminal Code of Canada, but what's sadly lacking in the Criminal Code of Canada is provisions to deal with online harassment. And sadly, and I can say this because it's a direct indictment against the Liberal government, Bill C-63 contains no provisions at all that deal with online harassment. C-412 does, and I don't know if you had a chance to dive into C-412 to take a look at the provisions that deal with online harassment. But the question I put to you, Ms. Panas, is do you think that law enforcement and judges should have more tools to provide no contact orders for criminal harassment online? Do you think that's a good idea?
Look, to even get to a situation where I have the courts involved and police involved would require me, a person who is already unsafe online, a person who's already facing enormous costs just to being visible, to have to report, to have to be believed by the police in the first place that these things are happening, that to have to address all the biases that are inherently built in law enforcement against trans people, that I'm more likely to just do nothing and probably withdraw. That is the consequence. And so you can give them all the tools that they want, but that requires reporting, requires people to believe and have a safe process. Bill C-63 provides means for us to be able to do that in a way that I feel that I would be believed for the first time, and that I would be supported for the first time, that would find some avenue to get that far. By time it's gone to police...
I'm going to interrupt you there, but C-63 does not provide an avenue for you to deal with online criminal harassment. It is a glaring oversight. C-412 provides a ready, able mechanism that addresses some of the concerns that you deal with. I just wanted to highlight that to you and encourage you to review that. I'm going to move on now to Ms. Hogan. Ms. Hogan.
I'm sorry, I have to question you on that because the best thing we can do is avoid these online harms from happening in the first place. By the time they get to the police and the courts, we're too late.
Thank you. Ms. Hogan, I heard your comments on AI avatars. Do you think it's important to have a broad definition of online operator with regard to the responsibilities tech company operators have and how their products interact with children in order to ensure that technological advancements don't outpace protections for children?
I think we've seen really strong approaches out of places like the UK where they have standards like reasonably likely to encounter versus products that are designed for children. We need to think expansively around that access question and around what does it mean to be social. Because any spaces where extensive communication took place, where kids have ongoing relationships that are facilitated by technology, we want to make sure that they are future-proofed under a similar umbrella.
Thank you. I believe that's my time.
Yes, thank you very much. We will now go for 5 minutes to MP Maloney, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today. There's a lot of to cover here. Ms. Panas, I'm going to start with something you said. You talked about, feeling comfortable, feeling safe online. Last Christmas Day, I posted a video standing in front of a Christmas tree at a community center wishing everybody a Merry Christmas. The first 5 or 6 or 10 comments were, I hope you lose the next election, rotten hell, blah, 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 blah. And those were the nice ones. But, I slough it off. I've got big shoulders. It doesn't matter. That's not what this bill is about. This bill is about protecting people who don't have that ability and who are the most vulnerable. And I want to pick up on what Mr. Brock was trying to do, and I want to thank you for your answers about the the difference between C63, which you support, and this 412, which I consider to be, well, it doesn't matter what I think. We've had witnesses who have said it's far too narrow and doesn't accomplish the goals we're trying to achieve here. One witness said that she thought it confused tort law with criminal law, which I agree with. And this is, I want to deal with this right off the bat. If something is posted online that's offensive, it involves some of the things we're talking about, which I won't use examples, C63 provides for a method to have it taken down from the internet right away. Contrast that with this so-called 412 solution, which would require somebody to go out and retain a lawyer, put together some sort of application or motion, go before a judge and try to convince him or her that this should be taken down. So first of all, you're dealing with people who are the most vulnerable, who don't know how to find a lawyer, who can't afford a lawyer, and you're going to have to find a lawyer who knows how to deal with this and appear before a judge who has no expertise in this. It's an insulting joke dressed up as policy. It's not effective. So I'd like to get that off the table. And I'm assuming you agree with that, Ms. Panas, because you've already highlighted the importance of having the ability to deal with this quickly.
Oh, I couldn't agree further, or couldn't agree more. I would challenge your conservative colleagues if you think putting yourself in front of a Christmas tree is giving you some grief online. I encourage your conservative colleagues to tweet support for trans people and trans rights and say trans women are women and see what kind of hate and abuse you get.
Right.
That's what I live with every day. You folks get to walk out of here, take off your MP hats and be okay. My identity, I don't get to take off my trans identity and be cis for the rest of the day because life is hard. My life is hard all day, every day. And that means trying to find a judge that will, or lawyers try to, again, find police that will even believe me that this thing even occurred. I would just, it's not possible.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So, Ms. Selby, I want to move over to you. I took your comments to mean that you're in support of the Digital Safety Commission. You're in support of the Ombudsman. You're in support of this process, which would provide this mechanism to respond and act quickly. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Okay. And it also means, as you quite accurately pointed out, that it provides consistency around the world too, because if you go with the court approach, you're going to have the challenges we just talked about, but it's not going to be consistent with what happens in the UK and Australia and other countries around the world, where now you're creating a group of people across the globe who have expertise in this, and you can address the problem. That was your point, I take it?
Absolutely. I also want to make one little point, is in Amsterdam right now, in Holland, they've experienced that when, for sexually exploitive material, it will take 3 days to take down child sexual exploitation material, but terrorist material is taken down immediately, within an hour. Now, we know that some of the adult online platforms can take down sexual exploitation material as soon as it is identified within an hour.
Right.
However, if regulation isn't put in place, the sexual exploitation material takes longer to take down.
Thank you. And we've heard from witnesses already who have lived through horrific experiences with their children and their families, who have tried to use the courts and the criminal process to address this, and they've tried to do it directly with the social media platforms, and it simply doesn't work, which is why this Digital Safety Commission and the Ombudsperson is so critical so that it can respond to it quickly. So I take it you support then Part 1 of C63. Is that right, Ms. Selby?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
I do. It's consistent with other countries in the world. It's consistent with Australia. I have a whole list of the countries if you want them.
Thank you
Okay,
very
thank you.
much. Thank you. We will now go to our final 2.5 minutes. Mr. Fortin, followed by Mr. McGregor. Monsieur Fortin.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to go back to Ms. Hogan. On the private messaging, C63, well, there was some discussion about including messaging, private direct messaging in it. There was a proposal that they could draw attention to individual requests for DMs and making recommendations for certain interests. It should also supply the mechanisms necessary, therefore, to make complaints about it and provide a whole structure. All of this seems very reasonable to me, but nonetheless, in these direct messages and the private messages of individuals, that there is a type of intrusion into privacy here. Do you think that this should be left private, or is there any way of putting into place provisions that would allow these address holders, these URLs, to better protect what is sent in messaging?
I think people should have the right to encrypted, secure, private messages. But that doesn't mean that platforms get carte blanche to do whatever they want in how they design these services or how people behave once they're on them. So I'll give you an example. You want to exclude things that say you must take down individual pieces of content from encrypted messaging because that requires breaking encryption. But if you say things like you need to articulate what you believe the risks are of how your product is designed today and have a plan to address them, that leads to things like what Instagram did just maybe 2 months ago, where they said, we're going to make all under 16 accounts private because we found that adults were contacting these children. That's an example of a behavior and design intervention, not a content intervention involving private messaging.
Merci, Madame Hogan.
Thank you. I've only got a few seconds left. Ms. Selby, what do you think about this?
So as far as I think all platforms need to have, as Ms. Hogan and so articulately said, a duty to articulate what they're going to do as far as their safety by design. I think that's the term we need to use here.
Merci à tous les témoins.
Thank you.
Thank you to the witnesses.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Hogan and Ms. Selby, I'd actually like to continue on that same subject because it was one of our previous witnesses, the Canadian Centre for Child Protection, who are expressly calling for private messaging services and certain aspects of private messaging features to be subject to regulation. And it's hard. So like my personal example, I've got 12-year-old twins. We've got them on children's messenger. We've started them off with iPads. We're not prepared to go to the cell phone yet. But I'm sure I'm going through what a lot of parents are going through. You know, this is the new frontier, and when they get their own cell phones, you know, how can I be sure that those messaging services are going to protect them? So, you know, you cited, Ms. Hogan, Instagram, but, you know, are social media companies doing enough, or do we need to take this regulatory approach? I'd just like to hear both of you offer a little bit of context. So maybe Ms. Hogan first and then Ms. Selby.
The only reason why Instagram took those actions, because they knew they could have taken those actions a decade ago, was because they were afraid of laws like this one. They were afraid of Australia banning access to social media for under 16s. They were afraid of the lawsuits that are happening in the United States. So you have to put them in situations where they are afraid of consequences, because the amount of money made from cutting corners and maximizing the amount of connections, no matter the risk for these kids, for advertising dollars, how addictive they are, they have to face consequences if you want them to behave well. But the second question on how do we keep secure encrypted messaging is we need to think a little bit more expansively. So, for example, if I am a child and I'm an encrypted messenger and an adult sends me a lewd image that I did not ask for, I don't want it, I should have the ability to report that adult. No encrypted messaging has been violated by me reporting that adult. And platforms should have an obligation to take people off their platforms to contact lots of children in that way.
Thank you. And I just want to give Ms. Selby the final 30 seconds if you want to comment.
Sure. So I agree 100% with Ms. Hogan. Absolutely. But I think we need to go bigger. The umbrella needs to extend, as I mentioned in my discussion. It needs to include all internet sites need regulation, because this duty of them taking responsibility early has not happened. As Francis says, it only happened because they have been worried about regulation that's coming forward like this.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all witnesses and for appearing today in person and on the screen. I will simply add that if you believe there's anything else you'd like to send to us, please do so through the clerk in writing. If there's anything that you feel that you wanted to say and didn't get an opportunity to today. So with those words, what I will do is I'll suspend for 2 minutes while we get ready the next panelist. Thank you so much. Je souhaite maintenant accueillir à titre
I'd like to welcome Andrew Clement,
University of Toronto par videoconference, and I hope that
on video conference.
everybody's able to understand both languages, and you've selected the right language of your choice on the bottom. Monsieur Guillaume Rousseau, professeur
Mr. Guillaume Rousseau, full professor and director, graduate applied state law and policy programs, University of Sherbrooke, video.
titulation. Joanna Baron, Directrice Executive. She is here in person. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. And we will now resume our presentation. Each panelist will be allowed up to 5 minutes for your opening remarks, and I will use the 30-second screen, and the time is up for when your time is up. So I will now ask Monsieur Andrew Clement to please commence your opening remarks for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members, for the opportunity to contribute to your important pre-study of Bill C-63, the Online Harms Act. I'm Andrew Clement, a professor emeritus in the Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto, speaking on my own behalf. I'm a computer scientist by training and have long studied the social and policy implications of computerization. I'm also a grandfather of 2 young girls, so bring both a professional and personal interest to the complex issues you're having to grapple with. I will confine my remarks to addressing a glaring absence in Part 1 of the bill, which I generally support, the need for algorithmic transparency. Several witnesses have made a point about this, and particularly the work of Frances Hogan is important in this respect. Social media operators, broadly defined, provide their users with access to large quantities of various kinds of content, but they're not simply passive purveyors of information. They actively curate this content, making some inaccessible while amplifying other content based primarily on calculations of what users are most likely to respond to by clicking, liking, sharing, commenting, etc. An overriding priority for operators is to keep people on their site and exposed to revenue-producing advertising. In the blink of an eye, they select the specific content to display to an individual following precise instructions based on a combination of the individual's characteristics, such as demographics, behavior, and social network, and features of the content, such as keywords, income potential, and signed labels. This is referred to as an algorithmic content curation practice, or algorithmic practice for short. These algorithmic practices determine what appears most prominently in the tiny display space of personal devices and thereby guides users through the vast array of content possibilities. In conjunction with carefully designed interactive features, such curation practices become so compelling or even addictive that it holds the attention of, among others, U.S. teens for nearly 5 hours a day. Disturbingly, their time spent on social media is strongly correlated with adverse mental health outcomes, with a rapid rise in suicide rates starting around 2012. And we've heard testimony, vivid testimony about this from your other witnesses. Leading operators are aware of the adverse effects of their practices, but resist reform because it undermines their business models. While we need multiple approaches to promote safety online, a much better understanding of algorithmic curation practices is surely one of the most important. Canadians have begun calling for operators to be more transparent about their curation practices. The Citizen Assembly on Democratic Expression recommended that digital service providers be required to disclose the inner workings of their algorithms. Respondents to the online consultation regarding this proposed online harms legislation noted, quote, the importance of algorithmic transparency when setting out a regulatory regime. Your sister standing committee on public safety and national security has similarly recommended, and I quote, that the government of Canada work with platforms to encourage algorithmic transparency for better content moderation decisions. Internationally, the US, the EU, and others have developed or are developing regulatory regimes that address online platforms' algorithmic practices. Most large Social media services or online operators in Canada also operate in the EU, where they are already subject to algorithmic transparency requirements found in several laws, including the Digital Services Act. It requires that online platforms consistently ensure that recipients of their service are appropriately informed about how recommender systems impact the way information is displayed and can influence how information is presented to them. While Bill C-63 requires operators to provide detailed information about the harmful content accessible on the service, it is surprisingly silent on the algorithmic practices that are vital for determining the accessibility, the reach, and the effects of such content. This lapse is easily remedied through amendments by adding a definition of algorithmic content creation practice and by adding requirements for the inclusion of algorithmic content curation practices both in digital safety plans in Section 62 and to the electronic data accessible to accredited persons in Sections 73 and 74. I will offer specific amendment wording in a written submission. Thank you for your attention, and I welcome your questions.
Merci. Thank you very much. Maintenant, Monsieur Rousseau, s'il vous plaît.
Now, Mr. Rousseau, you have the floor.
Oui, très bien.
All right, go ahead. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak to Bill C-63. I apologize for my appearance. I had a surgery on my head yesterday. That's why I'm bandaged. But I'm telling you, it's something that is external and not internal. My mind's working fine. First of all, I want to draw your attention, since I'm a constitutional expert, to the freedom of expression. I want to draw your attention to the fact that Bill C-63 very much resembles Bill C-59 in Quebec in 2016. And, it's a little bit like Groundhog Day because they are extremely similar. And that reminds me the extent to which the federal and Quebec jurisdictions overlap when they should be exclusive to avoid this. I must say that I apologize for my aside on federalism here and the constitutional aspects of it, but I just wanted to say that if that interests you, you can always look at it from the perspective of the government of Quebec. But the bill in Quebec prohibited it included a ban on hate speech, and very often we had to look at it that very closely because it was and fight against it very markedly because it I have to say that there is a great deal in your bill that deals with sexual vilification, revenge porn, defamation, and so on. The victims of sexual harassment, that's all very important. But with respect to hate speech, it is a different issue. Part one rather, is okay, but parts 2 and parts 3 seem to herald an outcome that might be a little bit different. On closer examination, I think that we have to be very careful. So if you are going to pay more attention to C-63, you have to deal with parts 1 and 2, but you have to take out from part 3 the parts that deal with hate speech. Also, I have to say that the definition of operator is very vague, is very broad. And when you talk about vilification, defamation, it is a definition that is almost a circular declination because you have to be able to define what is said and why it is said. the mention is made of the Supreme Court, where we talk about human rights. It was referred to the Supreme Court. But again, here we have a type of circular argument. The definition of that is being used in the bill, which is one of the Supreme Court. I understand it on the technical level, but it is a definition that is not clear. It is not a good one to my mind, even if it comes from the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court is not infallible, but it is appealable. It is appealable because of that fact. But you bear in mind that it is not infallible. So I think you should take a look at Keystra, which deals with criminal matters that deal with this more than Wadcott. So I think you should take out the hate speech angle in your bill. You should be more targeted, perhaps, with the sexual victimization of minors, and also with your constituting an ombudsman, an office, and a commission. Well, it could be more limited. I think you might move away from the bureaucracy in your legislation. It is very bureaucratic, but you could provide some exemptions when you talk about, for example, C63 and C412. I also invite you to look at 407. Thank you so much for your attention.
Madame Baron, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to present before this committee. I represent the Canadian Constitution Foundation, which is a national legal charity that defends fundamental freedoms. We have participated in Whatcott, Fleming, Ward, and other seminal Supreme Court of Canada decisions on freedom of expression, and we view this bill, C63, as posing a grave threat to all Canadians' right to free speech and a flourishing democracy. We welcome the minister's announcement that he intends to split the bill, parts 1 and 4 of the bill, but we remain concerned about the constitutionality of aspects of part 1 as well as parts 2 and 3 in their entirety. First, I will address portions of the bill that expand sanctions for offenses related to hate speech, including harmful content and content that foments hatred. I am referring both to the mandate on the new Digital Safety Commissioner, which is created in Part 1 of the bill, as well as the expanded penalties for hate crimes in Part 2. Part 1 of the bill imposes obligations on an operator to implement measures that are adequate to mitigate the risk that users will be exposed to harmful content. This includes content that foments hatred. This office will cost around $200 million over 5 years and impose fines up to the millions of dollars on platforms. Part 2 of the bill, meanwhile, increases penalties for existing hate crimes, including promoting genocide, now punishable up to life. It also creates a new standalone offense for any federal offense motivated by hatred, Section 320, which is also now punishable up to life. Now, as the previous witness mentioned, and I agree with many of his comments, this is an inherently subjective concept, hate speech. These expanded penalties and regulatory obligations pose a risk of gross proportionality and excessive chill of protected expression. In Whatcott, the Supreme Court of Canada said that hatred encompasses only the most extreme manifestations captured by the words detestation and vilification. Only that type of speech can be penalized without violating the Charter. C63 adopts this language in Section 319(7). Hatred means the emotion that involves detestation or vilification. But detestation is really just a synonym for hate, and vilification is a highly subjective concept. We are in a present moment of passionate and often fraught disagreement in our society, where a lot of claims are made that are understood differently depending on context. For example, calling someone a Zionist presently may land as vilification, or more dubiously, promotion of genocide, or as praise, depending on the speaker and the audience. Just a few days ago, a former CBC producer, Shanaz Karmali, accused MP Kevin Wong of hateful expression for posing with an individual wearing an F Hamas sweatshirt on social media. That's the problem with criminalizing language. It's subjective. It shifts depending on context. And these concerns become pressing with the expanded sanctions proposed in Part 2. Even if our judges can be relied upon to respect principles of proportionality when sentencing an offender, under 320, for example, the range of available sentences in the law will now include life imprisonment. So it's not a frivolous possibility that prosecutors can refer judges to a range of sentencing up to life imprisonment for a crime such as vandalism, if it is alleged that the crime was motivated by hate. So the reality is that it's virtually impossible to identify in advance predictably a line that separates the merely awful but lawful from criminal hate speech. And this lack of clarity poses an urgent threat to online discourse, which is our current town square, and should brook this type of passionate adversarial disagreement. When these types of sanctions are in play, everyone has an incentive to err on the side of caution. Platforms will flag and remove content that is actually protected expression, and individuals will self-censor. Finally, I will briefly address Part 3 of the bill, which brings back a civil remedy for online hate speech, which allows members of the public to bring complaints for the Canadian Human Rights Commission. This would be disastrous, and you should not go forward with this proposal. Even if most alleged instances are dismissed for not meeting the threshold of hate speech, the penalties for individuals found liable, up to $50,000 paid to the government plus $20,000 to the victim, are severe enough that we can infer the new regime will lead to large amounts of soft pedaling of expression for fear of skirting the line. It will interfere severely with press freedom to publish controversial opinions, which are necessary to a flourishing civil society. And finally, process is punishment, even if the case does not proceed. We will see more people punished for protected expression. Thank you. I welcome your questions.
The time, it's 12:26, so I will guard my time effectively there to get us to 1 o'clock, but we will start with the first round and we'll leave it at 6 minutes each. I'm not sure, Mr. Brock, who's going to go.
It's me.
Yes, okay. MP Rempel-Garner, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Barron, I'd like to focus my line of questions on Section 140 in Part 1 of the bill, which is the section that lists the different types of powers that some of the regulator can make and enforce regulations. I note that there's over 25 different areas that the regulatory body would have the power to regulate on. Are you concerned, given the broad terms that are used, like harmful content in this bill, that Parliament just ceding regulatory, both rulemaking and enforcement capacity to this regulator in such a broad way could have serious implications on things like you mentioned, like press freedom and freedom of speech?
Yeah, absolutely. And my understanding is that the platforms are not clear on how this is actually going to work. They've had some conversations, and all of this is said to be, it will be worked out later. From what we know, this will come down to a lot of these decisions about speech that is perhaps close to the line, highly subjective. Much of it we know will end up being protected expression, even if it offends certain people or hurts certain people's feelings. Those decisions will come down to government-appointed bureaucrats, or, mindful of the severe financial consequences of running afoul of the bill to platforms.
Thank you. So it seems to me that a regulator without a legislated duty of care that includes clearly defined terms on what online platforms would be responsible for is sort of putting the cart before the horse in a potentially dangerous way, both from the perspective of delaying action that could protect victims, but also from allowing opportunities for an unelected regulator to place significant restrictions on speech without legislative oversight. Would you characterize that as an accurate fear in this situation?
Yes, I think that the goals that the government has spoken about, protecting children and victims of revenge porn, are pressing. I think it's unconscionable to create a new $200 million regulator to combat those very specific harms.
Would you say that it would be more effective for the government and perhaps all parties to spend time debating a legislated list of responsibilities for online platforms prior to abdicating responsibility? Or that the first step would be, the better first step prior to looking at a regulator would be for Parliament to define what that responsibility is?
I think that's fair.
Thank you. So with under Section 140, particularly Section H, this section gives the regulator powers to essentially label so-called harmful content. In that, I read it as the regulator would have almost greater authority than the Canadian Human Rights Commission currently has to regulate speech in a very undefined way. Would you characterize that as an accurate take?
I would say it's very vague and virtually unchecked.
So in that, I don't understand. I don't think that Part 1 can proceed. I think fundamentally for me, I am being asked as a legislator to abdicate my power to an unelected regulator to regulate speech in very broad terms. What do you think about that? Like, I fundamentally think that's wrong. And I think it's lazy on the part of the government, as opposed to actually putting forward legislation, which Conservatives have, Bill C-412, a starting point that could define what online platforms are, as opposed to just porting that responsibility with potential impingements on civil liberties to an unelected regulator.
I think Part 1 should not proceed. I think that the objectives of protecting children and online victims are pressing, but there are other ways of enforcing that. We also know that there are huge problems in the courts right now where individuals who are accused of child predation aren't even being tried because of backups in the criminal courts. There are many things that we should look at before we look at creating a three-headed hydra.
Thank you. So Conservatives have tabled Bill C-412. Would you recommend to this committee that perhaps we should be starting with a review of what should actually be in a list of responsibilities for online operators and debating that, as opposed to just porting unfettered powers into an unelected regulatory body that's going to cost $200 million?
Yes, you haven't asked me to comment on the substance of 412. We do have some concerns with some of the categories that are listed in 412, but I do think that it's worthy of further study and consideration. And I'm happy to talk about the categories that we have concerns with.
And fair enough. This was the whole point of 412, was to have an open debate about what platforms would be responsible for, rather than just porting that behind closed doors into an unelected regulator and giving them unfettered power to regulate speech or impinge on civil liberties. Do you think that that is something that the government or any member on this committee should endorse?
I'm not making any specific endorsements, but I do think that proceeding by way of law rather than regulation has benefits.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rumpel-Garden. We'll now move for 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît, pour député Brière.
Madame Brière, 6 minutes. Thank you. Hello to the witnesses. And Maître Rousseau, very nice to see you here. I hope that you get well soon, speedy recovery. You said in your opening remarks that it was adding bureaucracy, perhaps, but I don't know if if you have already been with us earlier. Did you hear Madame Parnas say today that her life is very difficult because of online hate, and that at present there is no process in place for protection? So this is a real problem. To have a process, it would be much preferable. I'd like to hear what you have to say about my statement.
Oui, donc merci.
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much for your question. from the member of Sherbrooke. It is particularly highly appreciated by myself. Well, a bill that deals only with sexual victimization and without any reference to hate speech, in a sense, would be preferable, because when you make a mixture of the two and you have the bureaucracy involved, it becomes more complicated. There are not necessarily linkages between the two. And then you have the trickle-down effect of the Commission, the Ombudsman, and the office itself. So I would say be very careful about protecting the freedom of expression. You have included this in terms of these sexual victimization, but you have to be very careful about it, because otherwise you will be moving into other areas, other voices that make up our democracy, as often exists in other pieces of legislation, in statutes. Somebody who feels that they are a victim will have recourse to existing statutes. We can imagine maybe a fund for justice that would be dedicated to the victims of vilification, of revenge porn, or so on. That's another possibility to consider. Thank you for your answer. But we did hear about a little girl who was abused, and the family is currently before the courts. Earlier, my colleague mentioned the case of parents not knowing where to turn, what to do. Wouldn't this be a way of helping them in the context in which I would say there has been an underestimation of the breadth of this and the complexity of this type of problem with these platforms? To protect our children so that they're not affected by what is online. The testimony that we have heard to date has really been heartbreaking and quite horrible. Wouldn't it be better to have something in place to protect our children, to help families, and to, if not eradicate online hate, reduce and diminish online hate, but to do it right, in the right way? Excellent point. Well, I just was saying earlier that if you create these three entities, you have to ensure that there's a certain volume. Is there enough volume there to be able to maintain these three entities? That's the question I have for you. But so if there is too much there, if there are too many streams, it becomes an even broader definition of harmful content. You might have an extraordinarily long list of things that can be justifiable, and the administrative tribunals would perhaps offer more rapid, direct access to justice, rather than the courts, which are drowning under their caseloads right now. With administrative law, there is necessarily access to justice. You have to look at the volume, the extent of the volume. 200 million for a budget. It seems it would lead us to think that access would be quite quick, but not necessarily so. There's a huge volume of cases. You may be able to turn to other methods through administrative courts. With the few seconds that I have left, thank you for being here, and thank you to all the witnesses who have been with us today. Thank you, Madame Brière. And now we will move on to Mr. Fortin, 6 minutes. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. We've got really great witnesses, two wonderful panels, and we don't have enough time to be able to ask all the questions we have for these extremely competent witnesses. And to one witness, I hope that you have a speedy recovery. Perhaps before I do anything, I didn't receive your preliminary remarks, your opening remarks, but you had some very interesting things to say. If you could send them to me, and that goes for all of the witnesses. Maître Rousseau, you spoke about the definition of hate. It is a definition that you see as problematic. I really didn't understand the decision of the Supreme Court that you referred to, which contained a definition that would be more appropriate. I'd like to hear you on this. Can you explain and expand on the decision? What was the name of the ruling of the Supreme Court, and can you give me more detail? Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for your question. I can send you my notes. I apologize. I drafted them last night, and I'm sorry they didn't reach you. That you will get them a little late. So I certainly will send some remarks in the coming days. The definition in the bill drew its inspiration from Saskatchewan versus Wincop. Very broad statements. Do they constitute defamation, vilification, or were they vague enough to escape that? The Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission versus Wincott dealt with this issue. It was all about intent. Discrimination, notwithstanding that there was intent, not intent. We drew our inspiration for the bill from a more criminal approach. So I noted versus Keystra. In 1987, it's in the statute, so you can find it, and it will allow you to interpret what the notion of hatred is. That is an intense, extreme emotion that is felt at the time that expresses extreme vilification. So, to my mind, this is a bit more restrained than the Wincott definition because intense, extreme, extreme character seems to me is a little bit too broad. And then they introduced the notion of vilification as well. So it slid towards the criminal side. Thank you very much, Maître Rousseau. With respect to personal freedom, is the definition improperly chosen? Do you think it could have some consequences for freedom of expression? Because we want to, there may be situations that won't be covered. If we had a good definition, a more pointed definition, there would be fewer attempts to have recourse to the courts. Well, yes, you can identify what is revenge porn, but you want to also at the same time protect freedom of expression. One way where it can be expressed more concretely is in the definition of hate itself, where you have the definition of hatred, which is at the very heart of what we have here. It has to be defined very precisely for two reasons. If you define hatred too broadly, the courts will sanction people who are at the limit, but in an open liberal democracy run the risk. if it's not clear, somebody who is before the courts will not know if what they have said will come under the aegis of the law itself or not. So there have to be limits. There have to be limits. There has to be a cooling effect that would countermand the risk that is run by the person who has gone before the courts. I have only 30 seconds left, but what you said brings me to what you said about abolishing religious ideas. Would that perhaps lead to more contestation before the courts? What is your opinion about the religious aspect? Yes, religious exceptions are not always clear. That is where you're really under the thumb of the bureaucracy. You want to be able to define that clearly without having it muddled by bureaucracy. Thank you.
MP McGregor, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thanks to all the witnesses for joining us today. This is an important pre-study on I think, on a very important subject matter for a lot of Canadians. Professor Clement, I'd like to start with you just on the subject of artificial intelligence. The other hat I wear is a member of the Public Safety Committee, and we've certainly heard from a lot of experts at that committee a lot of concern about just the rapid pace of development in artificial intelligence. Can you tell this committee what the role of artificial intelligence is with respect to algorithmic content, algorithmic content curation practices?
Well, thank you very much for that question. Artificial intelligence is not a very well-defined term. It's used very broadly, and it has multiple meanings, but we can think of it as a set of algorithmic techniques. So it's part of algorithmic practices on the part of these companies. I prefer to use the term algorithmic intensification rather than intelligence because these algorithms do not comprehend or understand content in the way that humans do. And so they're very limited in their ability to moderate content, particularly if it's going to be taken down. But AI is being used by the platforms in order particularly to keep people on their site, to keep the content sort of flowing and people clicking and so on. And that they can be quite good at because they can keep refining it as a statistical process. It also, as we've heard, now most recently with generative AI, it's being used to create deep fakes, which can be deeply misleading. And I think it's very important that when that is being done, it's clearly understood by the users that this is not a real, an authentic image that doesn't address all of the problems like, these AI friends that become seductive in various ways. But that's a start.
Thank you. In the course of the conversation around Bill C-63, my Conservative colleagues have mentioned one of their own bills, C-412. I want to mention another private member's bill brought in by my colleague, MP Peter Julian, Bill C-292, the Online Algorithm Transparency Act. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the features in that legislation and maybe how C-63 might not be hitting the mark of where we need to be in this space.
Well, thank you. I did look at the Bill 292, and in part it inspired my recommendations regarding algorithmic transparency, because that is a main feature of that bill. However, I think that what I'm proposing here around the prospective amendments to define algorithmic transparency will go beyond what your colleague has proposed in Bill C-292, in that his definition only refers to personal information, and there's a lot more information that goes into the algorithmic practices. And I think it's very important that we understand all of the aspects of the way in which online operators curate information. So I think it's a good start. I think C63 can go further, but it needs an algorithmic transparency amendment.
Thank you very much. Ms. Barron, maybe I'll turn to you for my last question. In your opening remarks, you were talking about, the importance of protecting freedom of expression, and that, this is the new public square. I mean, one key difference, though, is unlike the physical town square, the digital town square is not a passive bystander. And we know on platforms, those algorithms can play a role in amplifying some content while suppressing others. And it can have a very real effect of pushing some people into some pretty dark corners. We just heard from a witness in the previous panel, a member of the LGBTQ community, who said that her ability to freely express herself with the status quo is being hampered. So, how would you like to tackle that? Because we're trying to figure a way forward here. How do we protect her ability to freely express herself? Because the status quo is greatly impugning her right.
I didn't see the other witnesses' testimony, but I will say the beautiful thing about these online platforms is that there are many of them, right? There's Blue Sky, there's Twitter, there's Instagram. There are different communities that have different norms, and as we've seen since Elon acquired Twitter, many people have chosen to migrate to Blue Sky, and you have every right to do so. Yeah. And I think putting down further government regulations, especially when we see that apparently the result in that is the ballooning three-headed $200 million bureaucracy proposed in Part 1, the ends don't justify the means.
Okay, but would you have any comments on algorithmic transparency?
I'm a constitutional lawyer.
Okay, no worries.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. McGregor, and thank you to the witness. Recognizing the time, 12:51, I'll move very quickly now to the second round, and I'm going to abbreviate it a little bit and say, Mr. Van Popta, you have 4 minutes.
4 minutes. So thank you, Madam Chair. Now, before I ask questions of the witnesses, I want to put forward the motion of which I gave notice at the last meeting. We heard evidence earlier this week and today again that about the rapid growth of online harms, particularly for our children. And Professor Clement, I too am a granddad, and I have an image of my innocent grandchildren in my mind when I hear this evidence. So I'm very motivated to act quickly on this. This has definitely become a global epidemic that requires immediate action. Now, happily, our conservative motion, Private Members Bill 4112 addresses some of those issues in an immediate manner. And therefore, Madam Chair, I move the following motion, and we're asking for unanimous consent that the committee urgently undertake a pre-study of Bill C412, an act to enact the protection of minors in the digital age and to amend the criminal code. So I'm asking for unanimous consent on that.
Do we have unanimous consent? Sorry, Mr. McGregor.
Can you just read it one more time? Is it the motion that was discussed last time?
Okay, it is the same motion as last time.
No?
It's just okay.
I'm sorry.
Do you mind reading it one more time? Is this what I have?
My apologies if it's different. Same subject matter. That the committee urgently undertake a pre-study of Bill C412, an act to enact the protection of minors in the digital age and to amend the criminal code.
Do you have that? Do I have that? Okay. I know there's a few hands up before I ask. I think I've got Mr. McGregor
can I just
first.
Clarify something?
Yes, please. I think everybody wishes to clarify, but Mr. Maloney?
I assume the reason Mr. Van Popta is seeking unanimous consent is because this motion hasn't been circulated prior to right now. Is that right? Correct. Yeah, okay.
Okay, so that's why we don't have it. Okay, thank you for the clarification, because I didn't have that. Okay. I have Mr. McGregor, and then I have Monsieur Fortin, I believe. Mr. McGregor, you were still, or was that clarification? Because I was a bit confused as well.
So this is it's a slightly different worded motion from what was distributed last time. I'm not going to say yes, and I'm not going to say no at this point. I want some more time to think about it. So I would move, Madam Chair, that we adjourn the debate at this time.
Just a second.
Please give me a moment.
Yeah.
Okay, so Mr. Van Popta asked for unanimous consent. It's either a yes or a no. There's no, so do we have unanimous consent? We do not. Thank you very much. So Mr. Van Popta, I'm going to let you continue with your time for the questions.
Thank you. How much time do I have?
I will give you 2 minutes. How's that?
Okay, good. Thank you. 2 minutes.
But that's
So,
probably
Ms. Barron.
very nice to give you 2 minutes.
Thank you to all the witnesses. And Ms. Barron, I have a question for you. I'm reading from an article that was published in The Hub, written by you, 28 February of this year. You said the internet is an ugly place, and I agree with you. There's a lot of good, there's a lot of ugliness. And you said the Online Harms Act is a profoundly anti-free trade expression bill that threatens draconian penalties for online speech, chilling legitimate expressions by the mere specter of complaint to the Human Rights Commission or the new Digital Safety Commission of Canada. Now, you heard that the minister has parsed out parts 2 and 3 out of this bill, so I'm assuming it's a less offensive bill. But here's in your opinion, now here's my question to you. If we were to also remove part 1 so that all that's left is part 4, is that a good standalone bill? And could that work together with Bill 4112 as well?
So I think Part 4 should be moved forward immediately. It's pressing and urgent, and I think it's really unfortunate that this government has lumped it together with Parts 1, 2, and 3, which are entirely different. As for Bill 412, it does have language that is disconcertingly vague to us. Content that can lead to loneliness, content that constitutes bullying, content that is harmful to dignity. This is also vague and could lead to takedowns of protected content. So I think that bill needs to be debated and studied further.
Okay, fair enough. So, and hopefully we will debate it, and hopefully you will be back to give evidence on that. But my question really is, could the two be debated at the same time?
I believe so.
Like one doesn't contradict the other?
No.
Thank you very much for that. We will now go for 4 minutes, 2 minutes, and 2 minutes, and that will wrap it up. So, Mr. Mendicino, are you, or is it Mr. Maloney? Please go ahead, Mr. Maloney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. Ms. Barron, I want to pick up on something you said in your opening remarks. Look, you've been repeated yourself several times. You're not in favor of a Digital Safety Commission and the process laid out in Part 1. You just made it very clear you don't support 412 because it's too vague, which is a word that's been used by virtually every witness who's been asked about it. We've had 2 categories of witnesses on 412. They either didn't know about it or they didn't like it. So I'll leave that there. But what don't you like about the idea? Because you said in your opening remarks there's other ways of enforcing, other ways of enforcement, and then you went on to criticize the court process. So where does that leave us?
Well, first of all, the court process, we can look at the causes why there, first of all, we see shockingly lenient penalties being meted out to those individuals who are convicted.
With all due respect, that's an entirely different issue. We're talking about taking measures to remove stuff from the internet. It's got nothing to do with penalties for people who've been charged and convicted. So let's separate the two if we can, please.
Yeah, I think that there are just much more nimble and focused approaches that could go after, one, child sexual exploitation materials and child predation, as well as revenge porn. You do not need a $200 million regulator, commissioner, and also a lot of this, the majority of Canadians that are going to be affected by the provisions in Part 1 are adults who are perhaps communicating spicy opinions online. That is luckily the majority of individuals.
I'm asking you then, what are these nimble and useful approaches? Because so far all I've heard you say is one doesn't work and the courts are no good either. So what is it?
A pared down perhaps office that focuses just on revenge porn and child sexual exploitation
Okay,
materials.
so some sort of bureaucratic mechanism, some sort of structure in place, just not the one that's being proposed.
It's not my job.
Is that what you're saying?
Pardon me. It's not my job to present the precise mechanism. It's my job to point out a mechanism that would be less offending of constitutional rights.
Okay, well, it's our job to come up with a mechanism and come up with a solution. So when witnesses like you, who come here with a certain level of expertise, come here and criticize what's being proposed, I would really like to hear your thoughts on alternatives. So that's what I'm asking you, if you have any. And if you don't, then that's fine too.
I think I've said all that I have to say on what a future response should look like.
Okay.
But thank you.
Okay. All right. Now, you said something else that intrigued me. You said, I guess this is a sort of internet or social platform self-regulating. People can migrate from one platform to the other. So how does migrating from Twitter or Facebook over to Blue Sky, which is the current popular social media platform, help address the concerns of the mothers and the families and the victims we've heard from in this study in previous occasions? That does nothing other than go to a nicer platform. How does that address issues like the dark web? How does that create a solution for these families that are victims?
So to be clear, I was answering that question in the context of a witness who spoke about feeling unsafe while communicating on social platforms. I was not answering it in the context of child predators. I think that clearly all of the platforms are aware that this content gets distributed. They have algorithms. They have ways to flag it and remove it much faster. No doubt tragedies still happen, and to the extent possible, I think that should be addressed. But my comment about migrating to Blue Sky was in an entirely different context.
Okay, so if I could sum up your testimony then, you're here saying we need to take some drastic steps to protect children and create a safer online environment, but you're offering no solutions in a way to do that.
I'm saying existing penalties ought to be enforced. Do you think that this content is not already criminalized? Of course it is.
But it's not being removed from the online world, is it? And that's what this bill is about.
Thank you very much for that. I will go now for les derniers 2 minutes pour...
The last 2 minutes, Mr. Fortin, followed by Mr. McGregor. Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Barron, I think I understood on your LinkedIn that you spoke French, so I'll take advantage of that fact and ask you this. I don't want you to repeat what you've already said because I have noted it, but I want to bring you back to what Professor Russo was talking about, another subject, abolishing religious exceptions. C63, which would abolish 319 3B, and the provisions that would allow for defense against hate speech or anti-Semitic speech if it is based on a religious exception because you believe in that religion. It seems to me somewhat difficult to accept the fact that this could be done in the case of a religion, and the major religions, 97% of them are based, I would say, on love and finding ways to live together peaceably. So what do you think about this? Would it be a good idea to to take out these religious exceptions?
I think it's a very complicated question because I think there are inherent problems with criminalization of speech altogether. Having said that, I think as a secular, pluralistic society, if we're going to deem something as hate speech, it should be hate speech whether it's based in the individual's religious belief or whether it's based in some secular philosophy. If that's clear.
A minute and a half has gone by. but I would like to thank you for your answer, Ms. Baron. It was very clear, and I'll leave the rest of my time to the. Thank you, Mr. Fortin. I would like to thank all the witnesses today. And for our last 2 minutes.
Gregor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Barron, I guess I want to talk to you about your views on the responsibilities that social media companies should assume. An example was given in the previous panel about how Instagram suddenly made everyone who was 16 and younger, made their accounts private. It could have done this 10 years ago because there were people who were going through those images and trying to find ways to approach young teens. But Instagram did it because there was the threat of regulation coming their way. And so, these social media companies, they do have algorithms that can, amplify certain content, suppress others. What is your view on the government's role with, just making these social media companies have some basic standards of practice that allow people to safely participate online? Because again, one day it might be freedom of expression that's being compromised, and for people to freely express themselves. But the great fear is that this can follow them from the online space and manifest itself physically. People are feeling that their actual lives are on danger. So just your views on how we approach this subject of making social media companies more responsible for making a safer online space.
Well, I think that my instinct would be to say, and this is a bit out of my zone of expertise, but I think that when it comes to children and their use of social media, I think parents are primarily responsible, to be honest. I don't think that government should take the place of parents supervising.
Government's main job to protect its citizens? That's parents. I understand your point there. But at some point, we need to use the collective power of the state to just at least make these social media companies a little bit more responsible. I think that's just what I'm asking for.
So thank you. I'm going to have to say thank you very much to our witnesses that appeared in person and virtually, and wish everybody a wonderful, safe rest of today. And thank you very much to my committee members for a wonderful session, and I wish you all a very nice Christmas holiday season, and I will see you in January, and I can actually suspend now. Thank you.